Mary Lyons, the Wealth Woman.
And I'm Eric Alexander with Acorn Grove.
Welcome to the Wealth and Income Podcast. We are going to try a new format today. We are just in that new year, new us kind of phase, I guess, but we are going to do an in-depth deep dive on a concept which we've talked about before, kind of incrementally and in different stages. But what we are going to do is talk about the infinite banking concept, I think is how it is most commonly known on the internet.
Yeah. And what kind of prompted this? Because I think the prompting for this conversation was actually kind of fun.
Yeah. So one of the things that I tell people that we work with is that if they ever have a question, a financial question that they don't know the answer to, or if something keeps coming up and they want our take on it, that they should shoot me an email and say, talk more about this, or I have this question, could you answer it? And over, I guess, the winter holiday break, I received an email for someone that we have worked with and taught, who has done some implementation. And she said, I listened to a podcast and I have lots of questions. Would you be willing to address this on your podcast? And I thought, if she has this question, there are probably lots of other people who have this question. So this is going to be everything you ever wanted to know about the infinite banking concept, and probably a bunch of stuff you didn't want to know or didn't think to ask. But we're going to go deep in this conversation today.
I'm excited.
Yeah. So I will tell you, listening to this other podcast, which was also talking about the infinite banking concept, and they pitched it as like debunking the myth and the things that the insurance companies don't want you to know. The thing that struck me was that they tried to appear as if they were agnostic without actually being agnostic. So they said, we're normally investment guys, but we love insurance. That's why we recommend term insurance. We think insurance is important.
Right.
But the ability to be objective about all of the insurance tools that exist seemed to me to be somewhat lacking, because after doing a little digging about their actual business model and their day jobs, they're investment managers. And so it did not strike me as a truly unbiased source. And I know, Eric, you have some opinions about that too.
Yeah, well, and it was, I think the phrase that we talked a little bit about is you can tell they go with what they know because it's what they know, and they're trying to figure out how to fit that other part in. And to your point earlier, right? They say, well, we love insurance. It's great. We love term. And it's like, well, that's not
all insurance.
Yeah, and all insurance, like you're supposed to say that because you're an advisor, and that's like what you're supposed to say as an advisor.
You got to protect the families.
Right. Yeah. But the way you approach the problem and the way you approach the tool and the way you meter it out and do the metrics on it prove that all you really know is investments. And you're probably amazing investment advisors, but that's your lane, and you're sticking in that lane, and anything that doesn't fit in there is, persona non grata at that point, which was sort of driving me nuts.
Yeah. Well, and I think to that point, they said, we've got a industry insider who built us an insurance illustration, and we're going to go over that with you today. And the thing that struck me is that they appeared to have a very cursory understanding of insurance as a tool. And you could tell that in part by the way they spoke about it and how they made certain statements that had technical inaccuracies. But it actually showed up in the entirety of the conversation, because the infinite banking concept is a strategy and the insurance product is the tool. But they spent the entire podcast talking about the tool without addressing the actual strategy or whether or not it works. So it was marketed as, and Eric, it's been longer since I listened to it. So if you want to correct me, because I'm on a random tangent, you do it. but it struck me as we're going to talk to you about this concept and this strategy, and it ended up being sort of a tool bashing session
Right.
instead of a real look at whether or not the strategy works and how that strategy could or could not fit into an overarching financial picture.
Right. Yep. Well, they were, what's the old story, right? Like if I pull a fish out and throw him on the water, he's going to make a terrible dog. And it's like, well, it's because they belong in the ocean. They belong. It's like you can't judge this through that lens because that's not its job.
That's
Like,
what it's supposed to do.
right?
I
It's
tell you, Eric, as a total aside, I love working with you because there's never a day that you don't surprise me. I mean, like, I don't ever know what's going to come out of your mouth when we go into these
I don't
podcasts.
either. So that's
But
good.
I'm like, no, but I mean, I feel like after as long as we were together 15 years, I'm like, I've heard all his stories, I've heard all his phrases. And then you say
Stupid
something
jokes.
like that. And I'm like, where did that come from?
Yeah. But it's how we would look at it. It's how a lot of people would look at
Oh, you're right.
investments too, right? It's like, no, they're two different things. And it
They aren't
just
meant to do what the other one does. So why do we compare it? I mean,
right.
it's, here's the shoe and here's an apple. They're not going to do the same thing.
Right. Right. And I don't eat shoe leather and I don't wear an apple around, but
I hope
just
not.
it
I
is.
feel like this is derailing quickly.
Well, so
So here's the thing, okay, guys, is that we're going to do this through the lens that we usually approach things with. So we're going to talk about mindset, we're
yeah,
going to talk about strategy, and then we're going to talk about tool. So when I say we're doing a deep dive, like we're all into this concept. And the reason that we're doing it this way is in part because if you don't understand the mindset that you're supposed to approach a strategy with,
right.
then you're going to approach it maybe with an unwillingness or a preconceived notion or bias. So I think understanding the mindset of where this fits when it's done responsibly, and I'm going to underline that done responsibly part, is incredibly important because a lot of the information that's out there on the infinite banking concept
Yeah.
is either produced by people who don't like it because their primary objective is investments, or it's produced by people whose primary objective is insurance. And so it's like looking through the world through rose-colored glasses. It doesn't,
Right.
there's some things here that we need to be aware of in terms of funding and contracts and consequences and all of those types of things. So what we want to do is give you kind of how does it work from a technical perspective. So how should you look at how does it actually work? And what are the underlying fundamental concepts that you have to understand if you're going to use a strategy like this?
Right.
And then lastly, how does the contract actually work? And then we're going to pull it all together so that you can decide, do I like this as part of my strategy or not?
Right. Well, and so let's start with mindset because at the end of the day, after listening to that podcast, and it was a fairly lengthy podcast, you could tell that their worldview, the way they looked at winning was net worth. I
Right.
know that at the end of the day, when I'm winning, I want more dollars in my investment account, 401k, IRA, wherever it is. And the bigger the balance, the better. Like that's how I know I'm winning.
And I
And
think that's a very common way to look at the world.
for sure, for sure. Well, and it's how we've been marketed to for 40 years, 45 years at that point.
Decades.
Yeah. I mean, it for most of the people, as long as they've been saving, that has been the mantra: net worth, net worth, net worth, big pot of
Rate of
gold,
return to net worth.
right? And how much risk and how much return can you get and still sleep at night? And if you can balance those two things out, then you're done.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. And so you can look at everything that they looked at as far as, well, the rate of return this and the risk is this and blah 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 through that lens of net worth. And at a fundamental level, I think it's what makes us a little different than the average bear is when we look at mindset, I don't really care about net worth, and we can get into sequence of return risk and all of that stuff. But the way we look at winning is he who has the most income
Wins.
and wins, right? Period. End of story. And the more passive, the better. And if I have more income than birthdays and more income than expenses, then I've won the game of life. And everything else sort of proceeds from that end goal.
Right. When I think that is a fundamental shift for most people. And I want to spend a little bit more time on this piece because of that. What I think we are all looking for when we are searching the internet or having conversations with people is a clear and easy path towards the destination that we want to arrive at.
Right.
And so what tends to happen is instead of creating dynamic systems, we create what we feel is a linear path. And sometimes there are tremendous inefficiencies when you do something that on the surface seems simple. And I say that because
right.
if you just shoot for rate of return, I would actually make the argument, at least based on my life, that I have seen larger returns in investment deals that are real estate focused than I have in the S&P 500. So if my only measuring stick is I'm just shooting for potential rate of return, and I want to use that word potential because there's no guarantees in any investment, then why is the stock market the answer? Because I can get a higher rate of return somewhere else. And yet, almost every investment advisor that I have spoken to in my career or that I have listened to on a podcast or the radio is very focused on you should put all your money into the stock market because you can get a higher rate of return than you can get using other tools. So if that's our measuring stick, I think there's already some issues there.
Well, and it goes to that idea of it because it's what you know, it's where you go.
Right.
And so it is that path that we all take. And I think to some extent that's the challenge with what I would call some in the IBC, in the infinite banking concept community, is they go that same route. And it's the same wrong route. It's a different direction, but it is all you need is IBC.
All you need is a giant insurance policy and you're going to be just fine.
Right.
That's not right either.
Right.
And then I actually read an article recently that said, you know, these people who say, well, you need some insurance, but not all. See, they're walking it back because they already know it's not a good tool. And I was like, what? When I read that, I'm like, how is that the conclusion that you get to? Because we can sit here and talk about diversification and the importance of not owning only one asset class. Like we need to diversify across different assets. And then when we diversify outside of the stock market, suddenly that means something different other than being prudent and responsible. I always find that one to be very, very fascinating. And you know, the thing is that I think both of these things are important, right? I think that the stock market and investments and real estate and insurance, all of the different possible ways that you can invest, I think they're an important part of this conversation. And I think as long as we remember that we're creating a dynamic system, that's good. And I realize I've gone off on a tangent here. So I'm going to go back to this net worth versus income conversation.
Well, but you nailed it. And the way back here, I think too, is something that you nailed is from a mindset standpoint. I don't just want income, but I want to win in every single possible situation and scenario that I can possibly win in. And that is the essence of diversity is, well, what if real estate is really great for about 5 minutes, but right before I retire, we hit 08 and real estate is horrible to be in? What if the market is really great? Yeah. And so that it's this idea of spreading risk and making sure that in as many possible situations as we can think up, we have a path to be able to go win. Then diversity makes a ton of sense. And the dynamic system makes a ton of sense. Because they don't know what happens tomorrow. And it's this ultimate hubris that drives me just up a bloody wall is like A plus B times C, and I just do this and I dump it all in and I'm going to get this, whatever rate of return you want to assume. And then Bob's your uncle and you're good to go. And it's like, but there's nothing else in my life that works like that.
Well, that's a really good point. And I think that is a common tenet of conventional financial strategy, which is I'm just going to put it somewhere, hope for a good rate of return, go to sleep for 20, 30, 40 years, wake up, and then magically be wealthy.
Right.
And at least in my life, there is nothing that I can completely ignore for any period of time that ends up just crushing it.
And I wish I could do that. Like there was an old joke when I was growing up that, hey, I told my wife I loved her on our wedding day. If anything changes, I'll let you know, sweetie. But after that, like we're not doing this thing again, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like nothing in my life works that way. There's constant maintenance and constant update because the world keeps adjusting.
Right. Well, and I think that's a perfect lead into the next point, which is that money is not math, it's human behavior. So if it was just math, we could just leave it alone and it would just do whatever it was going to do. And we'd all wake up millionaires because we know what the formula is. But that's not how it works. If it was just about math, all the mathematicians would be billionaires. And that's not usually who ends up being a billionaire.
I saw a picture of a Ferrari the other day and the license plate said 2.2 GPA. That was their license plate. And it's like, there's a whole amount of like grit and power and struggle and everything else that makes wealth way more than just being smart at math, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I think even beyond that, right? If we start looking at, and I'm going to go back to this income versus net worth thing, because I'm going to make my point here before I move on to the next thing. I keep getting sidetracked because there are other things to say too. But the income versus net worth piece, if I am just looking at net worth, then I'm going to park my capital and let it just appreciate over time, right? I'm just hoping for one rate of return, one use for the dollar.
Right.
And if I'm looking at income, I'm going to make different decisions. So if I put a certain amount of money into the stock market and I know it's going to take, I'm going to use crazy numbers, $10 million. And then at a 3% safe withdrawal rate, which go back to what can you safely withdraw in retirement, or you could Google it. Almost everything that you're going to say right now says between 3 and 4%, but we have several podcasts that go in depth on that topic. $10 million might produce 300 grand a year.
Right.
Maybe 400 if you're being super aggressive with your withdrawals, but that would freak me out just given the research that we've done. If I'm just looking at rate of return and net worth, I'm going, ooh, $10 million is so much money. But if I'm thinking about income, I'm going, how could I get to $300,000 of income faster?
Yep.
And maybe I can put a down payment on multiple pieces of real estate and then take the profits from that real estate to create income. And then at the same time, I'll have appreciation on the property. And I'm not saying pick real estate, although I do realize I'm coming off bias towards real estate so far in this podcast. It's just at the top of my mind because I was just having a conversation about it. But when you start looking at what happens in that space, it might only take $1, $2, $3 million to produce $300,000 of income because the focus is income from the very beginning.
Right.
And then over time, those assets appreciate and you might end up with $10 million, but you could take 300 grand of income much sooner in that scenario. So you can, when you're thinking about income, the goal is to do more with less. When you were thinking about net worth, you were just trying to acquire assets on a balance sheet, and that doesn't necessarily translate into lifestyle.
Right.
I think I made the point. I think I'm good now.
I think
okay.
And to caveat that, maybe it's a business, maybe it's real estate, maybe it's something else. It could be hundreds of different things.
Any of those things.
Right.
Yeah.
But the focus is that.
How many times do we work with? And how many times do we work with business owners that are like, no, I don't want to put my money somewhere because I can get a better return in my business?
All day long. But then they're making like this full on one stock bet on their whole life because they're sitting in their retirement plan. Like it's, what are you doing for retirement, Bob? Like, well, you're sitting in it. It's like, this is it. And it's like, well, you know that 80% of businesses fail. And they're like, not my business. And that to me, that's the human behavior part that tends to drive me nuts on that is that's, yeah, I get the math and the stats, but it won't ever happen to me. I'm smarter, I'm better. And it's like, but are you? And it's like, maybe
That's who
you
it
are.
happens to because of the lack of humility.
Right. And that's the hubris
Hubris.
of that one size fits all solution is everything has to work out exactly right. And it
Well,
fails in
and
my
the thing,
point on that mindset.
yeah, and the thing to remember about those types of situations are the thing that causes failure is almost always outside of your control.
Yes.
It's not usually something you're doing that's blowing it up. It's something outside of your control. It could be a change in the interest rate environment. It could be that, a certain portion of the industry falls apart. It could be, a completely black swan event like the crisis in 2008. I mean, there's nobody could have seen that. Well, maybe some people could have, but we can all see in hindsight why that happened. Leading
Right.
up to it, very few people realized it was going to. And
Right. And they
certainly
look
the
like crazy
timing of it.
people. That's the thing. They look like crazy people when they're waving the flag, like this isn't going to work. And everybody's like, dude, what are you smoking? Right. And
The world is going to end on November 13th.
that's right.
That's what it sounds like when people say that.
Yeah.
So I think kind of addressing some of that is really important. And there are some things happening right now too, which we're going to talk about as we go through the podcast. So one of those things is a concept actually, which I had no label for, Eric, until a conversation with you. And that's the idea of recency bias.
Oh, right.
Once you said that, I was like, oh, I can finally articulate it. Can you talk
Right.
about recency bias for just a second? Because I
Yes.
think this really is going to play a part when we get into the strategy.
Well, and it's a thing that sort of drives me nuts because we've been doing this 15, 20 years now, right? And for most of the 15 to 20 years, the interest rate environment has been in the tank. Like if you're getting 0.5% or 1% out of a CD, man, you're killing it, right? And and it's funny because we've seen all of this stuff. And in the last, I don't know, proverbially 5 minutes, really the last maybe year, almost year and a half now, you could get CD rates in the 3, 4, 5, 6 range. And everybody's like,
Right.
man, it'll never be better than this. This will just keep rocking and rolling. I'm like, did you hit your head at some point? Did you black out and like fall asleep, Rapunzel? Like what happened? And it's like, well, yeah, but this will always be like this. And I'm like, really? Like you're old and I've met you before. You're old enough to remember what happened 3 years ago.
When it wasn't like this. Yeah.
Yes.
What is the phrase that we throw around in our office? The only constant is change.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's sort of forgetting that the world has been spinning for a long time. And I think it goes back to that idea too of, well, I'm going to go ask my parents or my grandparents or whoever what should be doing with our money because they're really successful. And it's a good model, right? Go to people that are successful, ask them what they're doing, and then replicate it.
Mhm.
The problem is that we've talked about this ad nauseum, right? For most of the grandparents and parents, they have pensions, they have other things that you don't have anymore, and the world has shifted. And so it's a matter of looking backwards, but also looking at where the world is now and understanding the context, and not just taking, well, today is what's going on, and it will always be that way.
Yeah, and I actually think there's a little bit of a bridge here that is helpful from a mindset standpoint
Right.
because if we just went to our parents' generation and asked them like, how should I watch a movie? It would be a VHS tape on a TV that had very low resolution. But
Right.
since then, I mean, what did we go through? Is it betas? I never had a beta. We had VHS in my house when we were growing up.
Yep. Yep.
And then it went to DVDs, and then it went to Blu-rays, and then it went to streaming. Meanwhile, like the TVs are totally different now. They're built differently. They have different technology. You can
Right.
still watch pictures on them that are moving on the screen,
Right.
but it is a radically different television than, the big fat one from the 70s that had all the tubes and stuff in it.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
so I think that, we have this idea that we just need to go talk to our parents about this stuff or to someone that's older than us. But what happens sometimes is you miss the part that is creative or innovative or adapting.
Right.
You get stuck in old ways, and that's fine. Some people are what I would call technology laggards, right? Like they still have that dial-up phone plugged in and they're using that to make phone calls. but the rest of us are all talking on cell phones that we keep in our pocket or a purse. And it's a different reality today, and the possibilities are different. And I would actually argue that there's been a lot of new ways of thinking in the financial space that are key. And I think we're seeing some of that play out right now because you have certain camps arguing with each other. But the fact of the matter is, you don't have to make either or decisions. It doesn't have to be either investments or insurance. It can be and.
Right.
And what we're looking for is that sort of have your cake and eat it too moment where we get to do more with the same resources.
Well, and one, to kind of pull this either or and analogy string slightly, I think where I can look back and look at parents' generation, grandparent generation and go, hey, what are you doing and how do you go make that work, is they had a focus on income, they had a focus on security, they had a focus on safety throughout the system because they had seen the parents that had grown up in the Great Depression or had parents that grew up in the Great Depression have a very different mindset for money and savings and everything else than you or I, Gen X, Gen Z. And so how do I learn from that? Are you a millennial? That's right. Okay.
Yeah.
Never remember which one you are. I'm the forgotten generation.
I'm young enough to be a Gen Z. That's nice, I guess.
But there's certain components of how do we take what's working and be smart about it strategically and integrate the new stuff that's come in that can make what's working better, but have a broader view over what's really going on, right? And not that recency bias of what happened 5 minutes ago, but not also be blind to it and trying to find that balance between it.
Well, I love that because it's saying don't throw away what's old just because it's old.
Correct.
If it's working, keep it, and then continue innovation and creativity and looking for newer, better ways to do things at the same time. And that sort of integration of old and new is really where there can be some magic. And I think that's brilliant. Thank you. That's really helpful.
All right. So talk to me about strategy. I think we've beaten the mindset.
Well, wait, no, I'm not ready to move on yet. Yeah, I want to stay here for just a second on the mindset piece because I think the other thing that frequently happens is that we're all waiting for the catch.
Oh,
Where's
yeah,
the gotcha? Right? I mean, and honestly, with regards to this concept in general, the infinite banking concept, because I've seen some of those TikTok videos by some of those influencers. Is that what we're supposed to call them? Financial influencers.
Yes.
Man, it feels like a used car salesman.
Yep.
Not to insult used car salesmen. I mean, it is so glitchy. And I have seen some of the like clips from a podcast they did, or, where they're working on a whiteboard and they make these statements about rates of return that are flat out wrong.
Right.
They don't address cost of capital. They don't address what you had to do to build up the capital in the first place. They aren't talking about concepts like opportunity costs, what else you could have done with the money. There's all these things, and it's so salesy that even on concepts I know and understand, I find myself being like, there's no way that's real.
Yeah, the delivery hurts the message. Yeah. Yeah,
if you are watching this, what happened just now is, or if you're not watching, if you're listening, Eric just did that whole like, I'm out, lean back, right? Which I have seen him do when I get overly excited sometimes, but it's the way the information is being produced is creating doubt. And I think a large part of that reason is because what this concept actually does and the way it is pitched are two very different things.
Right. Yeah. And and we're not doing that IBC community is not doing itself any favors.
Right. Because the concept is strategically pretty good.
Right. In context with everything else. And that's the thing.
It cannot be the only thing you do.
Right.
And I think that's the mistake here, is that people say, do this, do this, do this. And then what happens is that creates skepticism, But I think there's a fine line between a healthy skepticism and
Yeah.
willful ignorance. And I say that because
Wow.
sometimes when we're exploring a concept and we don't like the delivery method of the concept, we reject it because we don't like the way it is being given to us without actually fully exploring the concept itself.
Well, and I remember talking to your dad years and years, decades ago at this point, right? Um, a lot of what the IBC concept can do is really pretty powerful. There's no reason to oversell it. There's no reason to pretty it up beyond what it actually does, because then it gets into the icky phase. And I
Right.
think that's what we're trying to avoid.
Well, and I think, I remember this one time. There was a representative from a third party asset management company that was coming in to talk to us about the work that they were doing.
Yeah.
And I took an instant dislike to this gentleman. Like, nope, not happening.
Yes.
Right. And it took you having a conversation with me about the difference between the content and the delivery for me to actually be able to listen.
Yeah.
Because I was like, I don't like this gentleman. I don't care what he has to say. But he was actually making really good points. He just had a terrible delivery. And I think that sometimes we don't like a delivery, so we reject something, or we say, well, that person is not credible, so what they're talking about must be wrong, as opposed to actually doing the research to figure out, is there merit in what this person is saying?
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And is
What
there a
you
way to
hear.
integrate it?
Yeah. I mean, you think about this, and I'll give another example of this. If you can imagine being in a fight with somebody, if they're yelling at you, what you actually hear, absorb, and retain from them is very different than what you hear and absorb from someone who is very calmly explaining their side of things without judgment.
Right.
Right. They could be giving you the exact same information, but you're going to listen to one and not the other. And so I think sometimes that delivery puts people off, and then they reject a concept. And because they have, and I'm going to use air quotes here, explored the concept, and they rejected it the first time, they're going to do whatever they can to confirm that they made the right decision. And I think being open-minded and looking for the real information and trying to find it from an unbiased source is really key.
Yeah, and I think it helps. The industry could help itself by. I remember we had a conversation. Gosh, this is years ago now. About one of the investment managers we worked with, and I love this guy. He's a total wonk. He's a total scientist, mathematician. And I remember I sat and listened for probably 45 minutes in his presentation. And for the first 30 minutes, all I heard was why this thing sucks. You should never do this strategy. It's horrible. Here's all the reasons that it's going to fail. And I'm like, Thomas, are you're a salesperson, right? Like, are you getting to the point where this is good? He's like, yes, but I'm going to spend the first 30 minutes out of 45 telling you all the ways it sucks. And then I'm going to spend the last 15 minutes telling you why it could be great. And because he did it in that fashion, I was like, okay, well, then I know all the warts. I know everywhere
Yeah.
this is going to fail. And if I can deal with that, then the good part about it, I believe in more. And so I think
Right.
we do ourselves a favor when we go, here's all the crappy parts. Here's all the good parts. Here's where it fits.
Well, I think that's right. And I'm going to give one more tool as we start to move into the strategy, one more way that you can start to digest some of this information, or how to try to figure out whether the source who's talking is credible, or even what perspective they're coming from. Anybody who uses the word when they're talking about the concept, building your own bank on yourself, becoming your own banker, any of those, I will tell you from a regulatory standpoint,
Right.
if you have your investment licenses, you cannot tell someone that starting an insurance policy, which is what the infinite banking concept is based off of, that's the structure that you use. You cannot tell somebody that building an insurance contract is building a bank. It is against every regulatory everything everywhere. You cannot do that. And so when people are talking about banking in this context and they're using that language, it is a pretty safe assumption that either they do not have their investment licenses and they are coming strictly from an insurance perspective,
Right.
or they've gone rogue and their compliance department doesn't know that they're making these videos and putting them on the internet.
Right.
Right. And then I think anytime that you hear people that are unilaterally talking about what's wrong with the concept, you can almost always assume that they're investment licensed and that insurance is not a substantial portion of their revenue.
Right. And
right?
Talk about
Because yeah, it's a selling against strategy. And if you think about it, I mean, I remember this from being a kid. I have kids now. I get to see it all the time. But when there's one toy and two kids, there's always a fight. So if you have a finite amount of dollars and there are two camps who want your money in order for their institution to be profitable, they're going to tell you what's wrong with the other side, right? We see this in politics. We saw this over COVID with vaccines or no vaccines. We see this with insurance versus investments. The list goes on and on and on, right? So what happens when you get that sort of subversive conversation going and there's trash talking of both sides is that you lose the ability to collaborate. So you limit the picture you can paint because you've only got one paint color.
Yep. Yeah. And I like that idea of the collaboration because that's the meat. That's where the magic happens, I think, on a lot of the really sort of important strategies is that collaboration and these two tools and these two strategies and these two or three asset classes all working together are way more powerful than any one of them by themselves. And that to me is the kind of the beautiful part of it.
Yep. All right. Are we ready for strategy now?
Now I'm ready. I wasn't ready before.
But you're ready now, though. Okay. Okay. So what we're going to do now, and this is, well, wait, maybe one more piece of mindset. Opinions don't matter. What we care about is evidence. That's my last piece of mindset right there as we go into this. And so having stated that, we are going to start with a game. So Eric, if you want to sort of lead us off with the game, or I can do it, you let me know. Yeah. I can pull up some calculators because we're going to do a little bit of math right now. A
little bit of math. All right. So while she's pulling that up, I'll set us up. So we call this the car game, and we've been playing this, I don't know, 4 million times over the last probably 15 years. And so you walk in, what kind of car are we buying, Mary?
I don't know. So I actually was in a seminar and somebody was talking about cars and they said that across America, the average price of a car right now is $45,000. And I was like, man, I don't know what cars you're looking at because it seems like everybody I know is driving a Tahoe, and Tahoes run like 90. Yeah. So let's skew light. Let's go 50. So like slightly above the average price of a car, but not by a whole lot.
Fair enough.
50 grand.
So you're walking in, you've got 50 grand in the bank. I'm going to pretend to be your banker in this story, right? And you've got 50 grand and it's time to go buy your next car, your next vehicle. As your banker and as your duly representative of the bank, I don't really want you to leave the bank with your money. That would be bad for us. And why is that bad for us as a banker?
That's bad for you because banks operate on a fractional reserve system. And what that means is if my 50 grand is in the bank, they can actually make multiple loans for $50,000. Right. So, if you think about that idea of them being able to loan out the money that many times, let's say they loan it out 10 times, you think about that, they can loan out $500,000 with 50,000 of actual dollars in the bank. And this right here is one of the reasons that I get a little turned off when people say, be your own bank or be your own banker, right? Because this system, the infinite banking concept, does not allow you to fractionally reserve the dollars you are going to borrow.
Right.
So that's the first thing. But the bank doesn't want you to take your 50 grand, because if they're loaning it out 4, 5, 6, 10 times, and let's say that they're charging 5% in interest on that money,
Right.
well, 10 loans at 5%, that's what, 50% now we're talking about. This is a huge amount of interest and income that the
Right.
bank is giving up if I take my cash, which I have on deposit with them, out of the bank. I cripple their ability to make multiple loans and multiple income sources.
Right. So you walk in, you want the 50K, you're going to go pull it out. And your theory at that point for most people is, if I walked into the dealership with $50,000 in cash and I just pulled it out and I fanned it out so it looked really nice and pretty, they'd give me this smoking deal on the car. And so if I walk in there, I'm gonna seem like big time, because then I'm just gonna, 50 grand on the barrel and I want the car, let's go. Right. So as a banker, I don't want you to leave because of the whole fractional banking thing. So I go, you know what, Mary, I got this deal for you, but we don't give this to everybody else. So why don't we kind of get off the floor so that not everybody hears this thing?
It's
So
special for me.
special just for you, one time only, push hard, second copy's yours. So I'm going to let you, we're going to make a loan to you. If you'll leave your money with us, if you'll leave your $50,000 with us, we're going to put it in a special vault. It's in the back. Nobody gets access to it. And I'm going to give you a 4% rate of return on that money, but you get to leave it here. You can't take it with you today. But I know the whole reason you darkened the door at the stupid bank this afternoon is you need the money. I don't know if you knew this, but we're a lending institution. We make car loans all the time. So we're going to loan you the money. We're going to loan you the 50K to go buy your car, your vehicle. But we're going to charge you some interest on this, and special deal for you, because everybody else right now, talk about recency bias, is getting a 9 or 10% loan, but we're going to give it to you for 6 because we've got collateral. It's a better deal. So we're going to pay you 4, you're going to pay us 6, but don't worry about it. We did the math before you walked in. We saw you coming, and you're gonna actually get a better deal on this thing. So do you want the deal? Do you want the loan? Do you trust the banker?
Yeah, I don't know. Right. I mean, this is let me tell you, I'm going to tell you the answers that I've heard when we play this game. I actually just did this last week in a webinar format, and I had people put in the chat whether or not they believe the banker.
Awesome.
There was not a single person that said they believed the banker. And I got a lot of friends that are bankers that I really like too. So this one made me chuckle. I'm like screenshotting it and texting it to them. No, I don't believe the banker. Bankers lie. And I was like, wow, that's harsh. That's real harsh. But I was like, I'm just going to take a picture of this, make a little meme out of it, send it to my buddy, let him know this is how people feel about his career. Right. No, but I mean, here's the thing. We were all in kindergarten the day that we learned 6 is bigger than 4. So if I'm paying you 6 and you're only giving me 4, I'm getting hosed. What's happened to my 2%? I'm mad.
Right.
You're trying to take advantage of me.
Well, and it goes back to the skepticism. Like we're taught to be skeptical of people and what they're doing with their money. And I think at a fundamental level, it's because we've never been taught how economics really works. And so because we don't understand, we assume someone is trying to take advantage of us.
Right. Well, because sometimes there are people that are, right? But here's the thing. We are taught to myopically focus on rate.
Yes.
Only look at the rate. Look at the rate, right? And what happens when we look at the rate is very different than when we look at the flow of money. Those are 2 different things. And I think it's really important here to really discuss the way that we learn and the times that things get in our way. And then we're actually going to go through the math with you. So if you're watching, great, you get visuals. If you're just listening, I'm going to do my best to make it almost the same for you. But here's what happens. We make decisions based on our gut or based on the knowledge that we have at the time we get asked the question. And we do the best we can with the knowledge that we have. But the things that typically get in our way are not the things we know. It is not the things we're aware we don't know, because we approach those from a sense of humility. It is not even the things we have blind spots about, because when someone makes us aware of the blind spot, we're no longer blind to it. So we're willing to actually do something about it. The thing that gets us into the most trouble are the things that we think we know that just aren't so. Those are the things that get us into trouble because we have very strong convictions about how things work. And when that happens, we are not open to the possibility that things could work differently. And this goes back to the mindset piece, is that we can't just say, well, I've already done the math, 6 is better than 4, I'm out, or we end up leaving money on the table.
Right. Well, and I think that mindset is that beginner's mindset that we all need to have for most things in life.
Right. Okay. So if you're watching, you can actually see us do this math. If not, we're going to walk you through it. What we're going to start with is that we are going to look at a 5-year time period, because a typical car note is roughly 5 years. So we're going to leave our cash in the bank for the same time period that we have an outstanding loan, because that's what the bank told us we needed to do. And we're going to start with a $50,000 loan. And Eric, what rate is the bank paying me for?
Yep. Getting 4 today.
Okay. So we're putting 4% in interest. So if you look at this interest compounding over a 5-year time period, the total amount of interest that you are going to receive over 5 years is $11,050. So this makes the assumption that as interest is being credited to your account, you are now receiving the same rate of interest, but on a larger balance. Right. And as your balance gets larger, the amount of interest you're receiving from the bank gets larger as well. That's the basics of compounding. We have all seen that growth chart where it looks slow, 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 and hockey sticks on the back end. That's happening because even if your rate stays the same, the flow of money is getting bigger because it's earning on more dollars. So at the end of this time period, the balance in your account, not accounting for taxes or anything else, we're using net numbers here for concept. The balance in your account is $61,050 after 5 years, and the bank gave you $11,050 in interest.
Right.
Anything that you want to add to that?
Nope. Okay.
Now let's look at the loan. If we take the same $50,000 loan, and we said that the bank was going to charge us 6% in interest, that makes our monthly car payment $967. So every month we're going to make that payment to the bank. What happens when we make that payment is that our balance shrinks. Well, the bank can only charge you interest on the balance of your account. So as your balance is shrinking, so does the amount of interest you pay, even though your car payment stays the same. Because over time, more and more of your payment is going to go to principal, and less of that is going to go to interest. So if you think about what happens when you buy a house, on the front end of buying a house, your payment is mostly interest, and you're looking at how much money is going in, and you're looking at that statement, you're like, man, I paid how much and got what in equity? But at the very tail end, almost everything that you're paying is going to equity. So car loans work the same way. They are amortized or using amortizing interest. Right. So if you make that car payment on time every single month during that 5-year time period, the total amount of interest that you are going to pay the bank is $7,998. So you're giving the bank $7,998, and the bank is giving you, in interest, thank you. And the bank is giving you $11,050. So if we just use round numbers here, 11,000 minus 8,000 is about $3,000.
Right. Right.
Are we surprised?
Yeah, and that's the first question is that we get from most people, that I've gotten from most people, is, well, I hadn't thought about it through that way, that idea of flow, and that one bucket is always getting bigger and the other bucket is always getting smaller. And once they see it, then it's like, okay, well, that makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. But until you see it, 6 is bigger than 4. Now,
at the risk of derailing this conversation, I'm going to add a wrinkle in here. Yeah. So I had a speaking engagement, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And I was speaking to a group of like financial, technical type of people that did mergers and acquisitions, and they were the number crunching side of this department.
Okay.
Highly educated group, right? So all of them had at least graduate level degrees. Many of them had masters. Some of them had PhDs. Universally, they answered the question the same way, with maybe one exception, who was like, no, I think the math works, right? And what was interesting is that she did not raise her hand to say that she believed that the math worked.
Right.
It wasn't until the end she came up afterwards and said, I didn't raise my hand because I figured my math, that I was wrong. I figured I was wrong because nobody else
Yep.
raised their hand. And I was like, man, that is some interesting psychology right there, because we don't want to be the weirdo that looks different, even if we think the math works, right? And so the thing that was interesting is that one of the questions at the end was, well, what would happen if you just paid cash and then built up your account again? So I ran the math on that. And this is, I think, really key. So we're going to clear this out for a second, because I want to address this, because there are some mindset issues that I think come along with this beyond just the math.
Yep.
Right. So if you start with a zero balance, and then instead you make the car payment to yourself. So you took out 50,000 from this account, and for some reason the bank is still going to give you this 4% incentive rate, and you're just going to pay $967?
$967. Yep.
$967 a month into this particular account. Here's what's crazy. You end up with $64,000, which is more than the 61 that you had, but most of that is your money. The bank is only giving you 6,000. So the interest that the bank is giving you is less. And so sometimes they like it, right? But here's the thing that is not taken into account, not factored in here. She was like, well, why wouldn't I just do that? Here's why.
It's an insightful question.
I thought it was a great question. It showed a lot of like critical thinking and engagement. And I was like, yay, they're listening to me. Right. But it, the thing that I thought was so good about this is that and I find that things come back to this sometimes. The conversation goes to what's the math, as opposed to going to what's the human behavior.
Yeah.
And so
I
think so. Because let's look at the tax side of things first. So let's make the assumption that somebody pays that $967 into this account.
Right.
So if you were putting money into a money market account or a savings account, your interest is going to be taxed at an ordinary income tax rate. Now, go verify that with your CPA, because I am not a tax advisor, so I'm not allowed to tell you to take my word for it. You need to actually verify that with somebody, right? Google it if you need to. But if you were in a 25% tax bracket and you had to pay the taxes out of this interest that you're receiving, instead of a 4% net rate, you end up with a 3% net rate. So I'm going to adjust that in our calculator. And when I adjust that, it drops down our account balance to $62,513. And the bank is now only paying about $4,500 in interest, a little less than that.
And to be fair, the original number on that, I think, was 61.
Yeah. So now we're way, way closer to that.
Right.
Now, I meet a lot of people that I get to talk to about their purchasing and acquisition strategies. And I've been having this particular conversation for about 20 years.
Yep.
So I can tell you that I've had this conversation with thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. I have never, in the entire history of my career, met somebody who pays cash and then has a spreadsheet where they are paying themselves back with interest and managing the exact interest flow the way a bank would. It is just not what we do.
Right.
We don't pay cash for something and then structure an amortized loan and pay ourselves back with a certain percentage of interest because that's what a bank would charge us. That's not what we do. I'm sure somebody does it, right? There's going to be an exception that proves my rule, but that's not the norm. So if we look at what the car payment would be without the interest, it's $833.
Right.
So even if I'm like, well, I'm going to make this payment back to myself and refill the hole that I just made, most people, if they are that disciplined to do a monthly payment instead of just chunking cash into it when they have to,
Right.
are going to have an experience where they pay $833 back into the account that only nets out 3% at a 25% tax bracket. And at the end of the day, they have $53,851. Congratulations. You're missing a whole lot of money in that scenario.
Wow. And that's, and the thing that we talk about so often is that's one transaction.
Right.
Right. And if you're older than 5 minutes old, you've made more than one transaction, more than one car, more than one down payment, more than one whatever. Right. And you will continue to do so. So, yeah. Well,
so
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, well, it goes to something you've said a million times, and it has become my motto in life. My merry motto is 90% of success in life is tricking yourself into making good choices.
Right.
And it reminds me of that piece of it, because you're right. I know of one person that's done something similar to that, but it is rare, and he is a rare individual.
Right.
But out of thousands of people, no, out of thousands and thousands of people, I've met one.
Yeah, very, very few people are going to build an amortization chart for how they pay themselves back after they've purchased a car.
Yep.
So could I prove out that perhaps you should do things a little bit differently? Sure. Do I think you're actually going to do it? Absolutely not.
Well, because the other version of this is what's the classic sort of investment strategy of buy term and invest the difference. Everyone buys the term, but they never invest the difference.
Right.
Right. It, like fundamental human behavior, it doesn't really happen that often. And so I like the idea of it, but very few people actually do it. And so that idea of sort of, and not, this is a poor way of saying it, but backing yourself into a corner so that you do the right thing, is a huge thing to go do, because when push comes to shove, we tend to go for the easiest way out.
If you can automate good behavior, I'm going to say this differently.
Yep.
If you can automate and reward good behavior, you will get further along than if you were having to constantly beat yourself over the head to get yourself to do something that you don't want. So here's what I like about this example. I don't like debt. I don't know anyone that's like, oh man, I love debt. It feels so good. Like there is literally maybe someone out there again, but like I haven't met that person yet. And I'm not saying leverage is bad. I'm just saying that most of us, when we have debt, have a sort of pressure that gets attached to that. And one of the things I like about a system where you have assets and you have the debt is that if you get into a tight spot where you cannot make the payment on the debt, you can surrender the cash and pay the debt off. And we already know you're going to be ahead. So there's not risk there. So if you think about when debt is bad, it's when your balance sheet goes negative. But if I have the corresponding asset still continuing to work and earn and grow for me, and I do get into a spot where I'm having a cash flow crunch, if I could just take my asset and pay the debt off, then I'm in the same position I was going to be in a cash position anyways, except that I've had growth on my capital along the way. Right. So there's that piece of it. And I think that is a huge piece of it. But the second piece is this. Because I don't like debt, I'm going to make that payment every single month. Yeah. And it forces me to save more money or to end up in a materially better spot than I would in this system where maybe I'm going to put it back, or maybe I'm going to be like, I don't feel like making that car payment because I don't have an immediate car purchase on the horizon. So instead, I'm going to book this trip to Cabo and I'm going to go do that. Right. There's some discipline here that helps with the human behavior part.
Yep.
So,
amen.
here's what I would say on this front. And I want to go back to the idea of recency bias before we move off of this calculator. The idea that you're going to be able to put your capital somewhere and always get 4% on it in a bank has not been feasible for about the past 15 years.
Right.
And then in the past 1 year, this is a possibility. And suddenly everybody wants to argue, I'm just going to do it in an actual bank because I can do it that way this year.
Right. And it's like, but that's only been for 5 minutes. Like for most of your adult life at this point, that's not been a thing.
Well, and doing it at a bank is not going to guarantee that you have a super low interest rate.
Right.
Plus, it shows up on your credit report and you have to make monthly payments.
Taxable.
Whereas if you can do it in a system that you don't actually have to, but you set up your auto draft to do it anyways, then you have a lot more freedom if you do need to skip a payment.
Well, and then I think it goes back to the mindset piece. And I want, as we go deeper into this, I want to keep pointing back to certain parts of the mindset is I want to be able to win in as many possible situations as I can win. Right. I'm going to pay that loan back. I absolutely am going to pay that loan back. It's going to be amazing. But what happens if I can't? I still want whatever system we've implemented, whatever path that we're on, I still have the ability to win and to pivot when whatever life's weirdness comes at us, to be able to go do that. And I think it goes back to this idea of a little bit of humility of here's what I know right now, but I have a beginner's mindset with most things. I can only learn more. I can never learn less. And something good is going to happen in my future and something bad is going to happen in my future. And I want to be able to pivot and win in whatever environment that looks like. And so how do I set myself up in a better place? And then that third piece of it, tricking myself into making good choices because I know that I'm a horrible human with frailties and laziness and all of the other things that come with being a human on the earth, right? Then I need to back myself into certain corners so that I'm forced to make good choices.
Right. Now, for the record, I don't think those things you just said about yourself are true, but I know you're also exaggerating for the sake of making a point. So I'll allow it.
Thank you.
So here's the thing. If you understand this concept, which is that you are going to keep your money earning for you at a predictable rate over the course of your lifetime, and you will still have the ability to borrow against it, some financial institution is going to hold those assets as collateral and then issue a loan to you, then you understand the underlying concept of this. So there is a point where I can break any system, right? If you're getting X amount in interest or if your loan is at a certain rate. But the thing that I think is key here is that if you can keep your money earning for you and you can do it with tax deferred growth and tax-free access, so it feels similar to tax-free, right? Then you don't have to factor in the lower tax rate and you can keep your money earning at a higher rate. And I think that's key. You want some of that predictability. And then just for the sake of making sure you see the break-even points, if we're doing a car loan, if you're being charged 8% on the $50,000, that boosts your car payment to $1,014 every month. The total amount of interest you pay on an 8% car loan over 5 years is just under $11,000. It's $10,829. You're still earning more at 4% than what you were paying out at 8%.
But that's about break even. Double the amortization rate, double the growth rate is where those two meet.
Right.
Years ago, 10 years ago, I had a conversation with a banker because it was just sort of being ornery with it. I was like, so if I give you money and put it in a CD, what can I earn right now? And the banker at the time says, I think about 1%. I'm like, okay, great. So can I do a securities-backed loan from the bank? He says, yeah, we do that all the time. And so, well, what's the rate? He says, man, they're great right now. They're 3%. And I'm like, that's 3x. Right. And so I did the math and I'm like, well, that makes no sense for me to go do that. Like I've got other ways to go do that. And so knowing, to your point, I can break anything. Knowing where it breaks is key so that when you get presented with the opportunity, you know it either fits or it doesn't.
Right. And I think the one thing that we haven't talked about here is that the infinite banking concept teaches you how to fund a whole life insurance policy so that you can do this. What often in this type of math gets negated is that there are other benefits on the insurance contract as well. So one of those is that it is life insurance. There is a death benefit. And in the event that you pass away, any loan that you have just gets subtracted from the death benefit, and your heirs get that death benefit. So it's not $1, one use. I'm building a fund, I'm borrowing against it. It is, I'm going to build this fund that I can borrow against, but I also have a death benefit. And most of the whole life insurance contracts that are being issued today, not all, but a lot of them, so make sure you read the fine print, have an element of long-term care insurance attached to that death benefit. Sure. And so if you are still living and you end up in a situation where you need long-term care, frequently you can tap into the death benefit while you're alive, tax-free, to pay for long-term care. So long-term care specifically would be assisted living, in-home health care, or nursing home or hospice. So those are the types of things that you can use that for. And those benefits are in addition to using this particular concept. And if you've been a longtime listener of the show, you also know that having death benefit and cash value dramatically changes how you get to spend your money when you retire. And so you're building that while keeping the growth on your assets the entire way.
Yeah. And I think you hit on something that's a little bit brilliant, because it's your way and you have a tendency to do that, is if I look through the lens of net worth, this seems dumb, right? If I look through the lens of IBC, or all I need is a bigger whole life policy, investments look dumb. But at the end of the day, the magic is in the middle, and the magic is in the coordination of assets working together. And that idea of sort of, the math aside of it, right? The 1 + 1 = 3. Like, it's the combination of different strategies working together, each doing a different job. And that sort of phalanx approach of covering different aspects of the tools, because the strategies are designed to go complement one another. And it's not one or the other. It's the combination of it that's really the power.
Right. Now, also to that point, you mentioned something a minute ago, which I want to bring back up. And that was the securities backed line.
Oh, right.
Right. So one of the questions that we hear frequently with regards to this topic is very much in line with, what if I could get a higher rate of return somewhere else?
Yeah.
So the question is, well, can I put my money in the stock market and do this same concept? And at a fundamental level, the answer is yes, you can, but the rules are going to be very, very different. So if you actually do this in an insurance contract, you can typically loan against about 95% of the total cash value that you have accumulated.
Right.
In a securities account, depending on risk tolerance, that's going to look very different. So if you said, I'm going to forego the insurance, I'm going to put a bunch of money into a brokerage account or a managed money account, I'm going to put it into the stock market, and then I want to borrow against it. Can you walk through how that works and where the risk is for something like that?
For sure.
Because it's not saying don't do that. It's saying understand where the risk is if you do.
Correct. And so in what we would call a securities backed line of credit, and some asset managers will do it, some of them won't. Basically, they're doing something fairly similar. Hey, we've got your money. It's in this bucket. We're managing the money. We're doing the thing. And we're going to use that money as collateral to go give you money from their bank, effectively, or something that looks like a bank. And what they do is, and to your point, like if it's a very, very aggressive account, if all your money is in AT&T stock, let's say, or Enron stock or something like that, right? You're not going to get much of that money, maybe 50%. 40, 50% on that side, because there's a high amount of risk in that thing that one asset could drop all the way to the bottom. If you're in a really, really conservative portfolio, it's all bonds and T-bills and mortgage-backed securities or whatever you're buying at that point, then you might get access to more of it, maybe 70, 75, somewhere in that neighborhood, probably closer to 70. And because there's not as much risk in the portfolio, they'll give you access to more. But there's nowhere I've ever seen that'll give you 90, 95% of it. Like that's not a thing. Because at some point there's some underlying risk in that portfolio that if it gets too far down, they start making some uncomfortable phone calls. Hey, you're going to have to start making these monies back. We're going to need maybe a call note where you've got to start putting back more than just maybe the interest or the monthly payment. You've got to start making up some of that gap. And that's where we've seen some things in the past when they've done margin loans is we're buying on the margin of the stock and the stock drops in a pretty appreciable manner. And you get a really unpleasant phone call from the broker going, hey, you owe us 50 grand or you owe us whatever that gap was that you need to make up. And usually those problems don't occur when the market's up and swimming and everyone's doing great. They always tend to happen when everything is crashing down around your ankles. And so the upside is you get the money in the market, you can make it work a little harder potentially. The downside is you've introduced a variable in your system for which you don't control. And to your point about the businesses, a lot of times when businesses fail, it's not typically because the business owner went to Vegas and bet it all on red and just it didn't go well. It's the market shifted. We bought a bunch of CDs and then streaming came out. Like it's things that are typically outside of your control. And that's where the securities backed line of credit can sometimes get you into hot water.
Yeah. So I had the opportunity very, very early in my career to sit down with somebody who worked for Microsoft in the early Microsoft days.
Yeah.
And so he hit it big time when Microsoft IPO'd. Big time. And he had a financial advisor who was like, surefire deal. This is what we're going to do. He had a margin account. Right. He lost in 2008, he lost $10 million in one day.
Gosh.
So not only did the market go down, but then they called his note due because he owed more than the new value of his account. So they sold off more of his stock to pay that back. Yep. So not only did he have the loss, but the loss got compounded in order to pay the overage on the note and get his ratios back in alignment. So it was a brutal, brutal day for him. And he went from being pretty much set for life to, he still had some money, but it's not like it was prior because he lost more money after that. But
and he lost the vehicle that would have allowed him to grow it back because they had to sell the stock.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry.
Right. So no, that's a really, really good point. I'm glad that you made it. And that definitely had a major impact in how I look at risk exposure.
Yeah.
Because it's the idea of if I have an asset, so whole life insurance has some guarantees attached to it. So there is no risk that something like that could happen in a whole life insurance policy. And that is probably part of the reason that we like it. But when you introduce guarantees, what you lose is potential upside. And so there's a much more conservative rate of return than what you might be able to get if you just went straight into the S&P 500 or did something more speculative like a real estate deal. So the thing I think here is to make sure that you understand the concept, right? And then the tool becomes very important. But the strategy that we're deploying here is how do I keep as much of my money earning for me as possible? And how do I get my money compounding for me as soon as possible? And then anytime I'm going to go and make an acquisition, whether it's a car, which depreciates in value, or a rental property, which could appreciate in value, I'm going to be very strategic about how I find the capital to acquire that. And when you think about the underlying concept, what you really want is your money earning for you. And then you want to go find the cheapest capital that you can use to make your acquisition. So there was a period of time when I bought my last car and the interest rate environment was low enough that I could keep my money earning at 4% in my policy, 4% net of taxes, net of fees. But I could use the dealership's money at 1.9%. And I think actually I used a credit union when I did that, not the dealership. But at the time, the interest rate to borrow from the insurance company was 4.76%.
Right.
Why would I pay 4.76 to anyone if I could get away with paying 2?
Right.
And all of my money keeps doing the same thing. So just to illustrate that, if I were to go get money at 2%, remember when we did this at 6%, we were paying about $8,000 in interest on a $50,000 loan.
Right.
Well, if we can find a credit union that's willing to give us 2% and I still have my money sitting in my policy at 2% in interest on that $50,000 loan, I'm going to pay the credit union $2,583, but I get to keep 11,000. So when you get to the other side of this, it just gets even better.
Well, and I think it goes back to that idea is it's not about the tool, it's about the strategy. And if there's a better way to go deploy the strategy then go do that. But understand the mindset and strategy first so that you can narrow down your window of what tools are appropriate. And you can get into a faster way of saying, nope, that's not it, that doesn't work for these reasons. And you have a better way to go filter, like your filters in a finer tuned way. And we talk a lot about on this other end, because I want to keep going back to this idea of I want to win in every scenario, is when the world is great and I can buy, let's make real estate again, right? I'm going to go buy the real estate, it's going to appreciate, I'm going to be a billionaire, whatever that story is, right? Or I'm going to go buy a car because I need a car or a vacation, whatever.
I'm going to go buy a business. Fine.
I'm going to go buy a business, right? But there's other parts in life, and we've all been there, where it wasn't an opportunity. It was chaos. And I didn't need cash for something really cool or really like sexy. I'm going to go buy a business. I need money because something just punched me in the mouth and I need to go figure out how to deal with it. And there's an emotional challenge that comes with I've screwed up or something happens and I need to go get cash. And if I'm draining a bank account to go do that, I just see the negative. I just see the hole that I've created from an event or a bad choice. But if I'm pulling from an asset where I know I'm not going to lose ground on the compounding and I'm dealing with a short-term issue and I get to put it back, then I know from a family standpoint, from a longevity, generationally, whatever, it's a bad situation, but it's not deleterious long-term. Like I've not put myself in a horrible place.
I'll give a real example of that. So I'm going to look at the same situation from two different lenses. Let's say that someone has maxed out a 401k and that's where all of their dollars were going, because we hear that recommendation all the time. The first thing you should do is max out your 401k, right? And I'm not saying good or bad what it is, right? I'm just saying, let's say that's what someone did.
Right.
So in that particular situation, if that's where all of their assets are sitting, and let's say maybe they even had 3 months of cushion and they get laid off. If you think about the job environment during the financial crisis of, 2007 to 2009, finding a new job in a 3-month time period may or may not have been possible, depending on age, depending on skill set, all of those types of things.
Right.
And so, and expecting to get the same income might be different too. And so there were a lot of people that found themselves unemployed for longer than their 3-month cushion would actually support.
Right.
If all of your money is sitting in a 401k and you hit the end of your cushion, I can't tell you how many people I talked to during that point in my career where I was out networking, trying to build, just seeing what people were doing, that were having to tap into their 401k. So they were cashing out their 401ks because they'd been laid off. So they had to roll it into an IRA or they just got themselves sent a check. And not only did they pay the income taxes, but they also had to pay the 10% in penalty. And then they lost all of the growth on that money.
Yep.
And the amount of just negativity that whole situation creates is brutal.
The shame.
Now let's take, shame. Exactly. And it creates sometimes a sort of paralysis, and then you end up trying to catch up. And so you take risks you shouldn't have. Like there's a whole cascade of consequences that happen there. Now picture the same scenario, but using the infinite banking concept. You still maybe put money into the 401k to take advantage of the match, but the money that wasn't being matched, let's say you paid the taxes on it and then you put it into a policy.
Right.
You end up in the same position. You're laid off. You run through the first 3 months of your cushion and now you don't have cash anymore. The next step is to go take a loan from the insurance company they keep your cash value continuing to earn and grow for you. They don't care whether you can pay it back or not, like a traditional bank would, because here's the thing. If you pass away with a loan outstanding, they don't have to go through the legal process of going after your estate. It's already baked into the contract that they're just going to take it out of the benefit and then send everything else to your family. So it's easy to get a loan in that scenario where you could not get a loan because you're unemployed from any other source, including your home equity. Yep. And your money is continuing to earn for you because you're using the insurance company's money. So if you get to the point where you're like, man, I'm never going to be employed again, I'm never going to be able to pay this back, fine. Then you just eliminate the cash value that's being held as a collateral. Maybe you surrender the policy at that point, but you didn't pay a 10% penalty and destroy your financial plan. You could take 20 years of just putting $100 a month back into the policy and keep all the compounding on your capital the whole time because you're paying that loan back on your schedule. And that's one of the features that I think makes this so attractive, is that the loan from the insurance company is unstructured, meaning you determine how you pay it back. They don't.
Right.
So you think about strategically the outcomes. We're in two very different situations at that point because we've added diversification and we've added in a different concept.
Right. And from a diversity standpoint, if we're in a 2008 scenario and the markets drop by 30, 40, 50%, whatever the story is, I remember we had a rough day in the market. This is when your dad was still there. And I remember he walked by my office and he goes, man, did you see the market today? And I'm like, yeah, it was a brutal day, Joe. And he goes, I looked at my whole life contract, rocking. Like it still went up and to the right. I'm like, you jerk, get out of it, but he's like, it's nice to have a part of my portfolio that is not at the whim of what's going on. Yeah.
Well, and actually to your point, and this is a point that I didn't even make just a second ago, but what you said just triggered it, is that if all the money was in the 401k, it may have just taken that huge loss. You got half the money that you can even tap into, which I think is why you made that point, right? I mean,
my 401k became a 201k overnight.
Right.
Which is
so it's a different outcome. And I think this is the thing. These are the things that don't get talked about because people want to start arguing about whether a whole life insurance contract is good or not. And we're going to get to that through this conversation. Right. But I think understanding, most people aren't going to want to think about that low interest rate environment and keeping 3 to 6 months in cash.
Oh, it's brutal.
Like it's easy to say I'm willing to keep that much money in cash now because it's actually doing something and I can see that it's growing. But back in the day, that wasn't the case. So you start looking at some of these things that get said now, and it might work today. But what we're looking for is something that is, to Eric's point, which he has made repeatedly, and this is where I get to say you're brilliant. How do you win in every possible situation? Yeah. So we want to change the way you think about that in order to get there, right? So we've addressed recency bias, we've addressed discipline, and I think there's kind of two more things conceptually that I want to make sure we hit before we move into some of the practical things like insurance and contract and funding and all of those specifics where we're going to continue to do some comparisons. Right. Is that if you think about what you're really doing at a high level, you're making a choice between, do I want to put my money into a cash account where it could earn anywhere from 0 to call it 4% today, and I'm going to pay ordinary income tax on any of those dollars. And then in addition to that, whenever I use my money in a cash system, it's no longer earning or compounding for me. Right. And then I'm going to start over. So I fill up the bucket, drain it. I fill up the bucket of money and then I drain it. And I put money in the bucket and then I drain it. And so I'm constantly only earning on whatever is in the account. Right. Philosophically, you have to, if you're going to use this system, the switch that you are making is that you are moving into a world where you're putting money into a bucket that you're expecting roughly a 4% rate of return over the course of your lifetime. And that is net of taxes and fees. Right. Now we're going to address some of the things that were said in this other podcast about what you can get in a whole life policy and all of that. But that is the target that we are looking at. And then because there are no ordinary income taxes that are owed as the dollars are in the account, and you can access the money tax-free if you do it the right way, you're looking at better tax efficiencies over the course of your lifetime. And all of your money is always working for you because you're using the insurance company's money. Just like the banker went to the vault, the insurance company is pulling money out of their general fund for you to actually use. So you have
Right.
two radically different opportunities here. And instead of just your money doing one job in a cash account, you get all the benefits of the death benefit and possibly long-term care insurance in the long run.
And if you live in one of the more free states in the nation, you might get some asset protection. So, which is kind of nice.
And that's a good point. I mean, we live in Texas, and in Texas, there is complete protection from lawsuit and creditor
Yeah.
for dollars that are sitting in a whole life insurance policy. Not all states allow for that. So
Right. Your
there you
mileage may
go.
vary, but you know.
Right. And it's based on where you live when you acquire the contract. So once you have it, if you move to a different state, you keep the same treatment.
Right.
So I think those are important. And then the next thing that I can think of really goes back a little bit to mindset, but I think it's
Yeah.
also strategy. And it's the idea of, do I want to build a finite strategy or an infinite strategy?
Yeah.
And I think that this language came from probably the infinite banking concept when we were first exposed to it.
Yeah, and that and Simon Sinek, however you say his last name, there's some broader concepts around playing finite games and infinite games, but I think it's very similar in that nature.
Scarcity, abundance, same thing.
Right.
If you think about conventional planning, I take a job, I earn money, I take money, I'm going to pay any debt that I have, I'm going to pay for lifestyle, and whatever's left over, I'm going to save.
Right.
Once I put that money into a savings bucket, most frequently, if I'm pursuing conventional financial methodologies, it's either going to be a 401k, a Roth IRA, or some type of account that is attached to market returns. Could be an index fund, could be individual stocks, could be whatever you want it to be. What I am hoping for in that situation is what we call capital appreciation. It's rate of return and growth.
Right.
And as long as that rate of return is positive and my account is growing, I'm moving forward. And my measuring stick is either what was my rate of return or what is my net worth in that situation. For every dollar that is entering into my savings world, my personal economy, I'm getting one benefit for that dollar.
Yep.
And if I want more wealth, there are only a few ways that I can achieve that. I can work harder to generate more money, right? And if I generate more money, I have to save more of it in order to get where we're going. Or I can start chasing rates of return, which means I'm taking increasing levels of risk. How is an infinite system different, Eric?
Well, and I think part of it comes from that infinite compounding, right? That I'd never stop getting compounding on that wealth, I think is the first part of it. And there's some generational stuff we'll cover in a second, but I think that idea of continuously compounding wealth and continuously compounding money and using it as a flow, not as a bucket, I think is really kind of that first piece of it. And understanding that money in motion is more powerful than money at rest. But I think the other component of that is the efficiency gain. Like my background is supply chain, and so my efficiency brain always sort of veers into a ditch whenever we start talking about this. But we've talked about this a million times, so I'm going to hit it at a high level, but this idea that during retirement, because of sequence return risk and because of the 3% rule, and you touched on it earlier, if I get $10 million and I'm only able to touch 3% of it, that's 300K. And maybe that's enough, maybe it's not, but it's incredibly inefficient. But if I think about compounding assets and I think about the appreciation plus distribution and the fact that I'm building a system and not a set of tools, then from an efficiency standpoint, I can get a lot further, a lot faster without having to go brute force it or take a bunch of unnecessary risk. And because of that, I remember, years ago, not that many years ago, a couple of years ago, that idea of I've got $3, 3 months of savings in my savings account. I can't emotionally handle any more money they're earning zero.
Mhm.
And what we saw so many clients do in so many conversations is, I've got too many dollars sitting in this bucket. Where can I go put it?
I'm
And
going to put it at risk now.
I'm going to put it at risk. And then when something bad happens, all of this safety net money
Isn't
is
safe.
isn't safe anymore, right? But it's this sort of emotional trade-off between, I can't emotionally watch this money sit there earning zero. It's driving me crazy. And my only other version of that math is, I got to go put it in the stock market. I need a bigger rate of return. We're going to make this money work. And it
Right.
creates tremendous stress on the money. And funny enough, it creates a fair amount of stress on the relationship, because you're
Mm,
banking on something that you can't control. And as
mm,
great as Mary is, and as great as we are at what we do, I don't have a crystal ball and I don't control the market. And
right.
so why did the money go down? It's like, well, because you shouldn't have been banking on that money to go up. Like,
Right.
that was your safe money, and you put it in a place that was fundamentally unsafe. What did you think was going to happen? And it goes back to that
Right.
idea that we're all risk tolerant, or we're all return tolerant. Not very many of us are actually risk tolerant, especially in
Right.
those
And that goes
cases.
back to human behavior.
Exactly.
And I think that is an important thing to keep coming back to. So I want to talk through one concept, and you may have hit on it a little bit, but I want to go a little bit deeper in this
For sure.
too, because efficient distributions, I think, are key. Infinite compounding is key. But I also think there are other ways that we can drive wealth here too,
Right.
because let's say that I have put money into my policy and accumulated cash value. If I'm just looking at the return on the policy and I'm looking at the return I could get in the stock market wins. If that is the entirety of my comparison, the stock market wins. The stock market is generally going to have a higher rate of return than a whole life insurance
Over
contract
time.
over time, right? I mean, that I think anyone who tries to argue that point, I'm like, what are you doing? That like that's a
Yeah.
losing argument. So this goes back to, if I'm just looking at net worth, that's the whole story. It's $1, one use. That's all we're getting. It's that either or mentality. I can put it in the stock market or I can put it in insurance, and one of those has a higher rate of return. So if you're making either or choices, I don't know why anyone would pick insurance.
Yeah. It would be dumb.
I don't know why you would do that. But if you're making and choices, this is very different, because you should still have some money that are sitting in investments, invest in the stock market, whatever you're doing. But if you are funding the insurance contract, there will come a point in time, and I'll speak to my own usage here, where I want to borrow because I'm going to go buy a rental property. And especially in my 20s, I had multiple rental properties. And as I got older, I decided active management of rentals sometimes is a bit much. And then I stopped doing it for a while, and I was like, ooh, let's do vacation rentals, which is even more management than a long-term rental, but that's all an aside. So if you think about this world where you're going to go buy a rental property or a business, or you want to invest in some sort of deal that produces additional income, if you use the insurance company's money to do that, you have a cost of capital. And I'm going to be clear, because I think I've said this a couple of times and occasionally it gets misunderstood. It's cost of capital. So this is how much you're actually paying in interest to the insurance company. That is part of that offsets some of your return. So
For sure.
you're creating a position where you might have a lower tax burden at the end of your deal because of the cost of the capital that you're using, but confirm that with your CPA, because I can't give tax advice. So you're already creating a little bit more efficiency. But then when you go and acquire, let's say it's this rental property, and you use the profit to pay the loan you took back, that loan then goes away and your capital is there. And so your insurance is still on the same trajectory it was going to be on prior to acquiring the real estate. But now you also have the equity in the real estate and the appreciation over time, as well as the additional income. So now I'm not having to work substantially harder. I'm getting some passive income that's coming in,
Right.
and I'm still going to have appreciation over time, which is what we were looking for before: capital growth, rate of return.
Right.
But now I have that extra income. So I could use some of that to build the policy bigger. And then I'm going to borrow against it and go acquire another property. Well, maybe the first property was cash flow positive, $10,000. And now I bought another identical property that is cash flow positive, $10,000. well, if I have $20,000 coming in profit, I'm going to pay that loan back in half the time this time, right?
Right.
I'm going to, because I have twice as much money going to pay it back.
Right.
And so then I can borrow again because I have paid off the loan. So if my collateral is released, I can borrow against it again and do it a third time and then a fourth time. And so when you start to look at the possibilities, instead of them being very finite based only on growth, now we're creating a world where I can do that as many times as is feasible, given the investment choices that I make. My possibilities are infinite at this point. And so I think some of what has to happen is, if what you want is just a park it and never think about it again kind of strategy, then the infinite banking concept is probably not for you. There might be other reasons that you would want a whole life insurance policy, like easy button income and some of the other strategies that we teach. But if you don't want to be actively involved with acquiring other assets that produce income, I would argue that you probably could stop listening to the podcast right now and just opt out.
Well, and it goes to my running joke that it's a little bit of a Swiss Army knife, and so just don't use the tweezers. Like, just forget about that part of that feature in the tool set, and have it be there for emergency fund, and just be done, right? And I think there's nothing wrong with that. And that's not I think it's easy to see it as a judgment. Like, really, you're not going to be like a billionaire real estate investor mogul? Like, that's not what I wanted to do. No,
maybe that's not your motivator.
In the middle of where we are with the cabin in Broken Bow, I'm like, I don't want to do this ever again. I've never had I've never had a baby. My wife has had a baby, but I'm watching through that process going, why would you ever do this twice? Like, I don't understand. This seems horrible. And that's kind of how I am right now. Like, I'm hoping at the other end of birthing this cabin, we're like, maybe that wasn't so bad in hindsight, but right now I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm done.
But we have multiple clients who have multiple VRBO properties and they love it and they're building a life on it. So again, like, some of this goes to personal preference and what you actually are willing to do versus what you aren't willing to do. And so that's key. And that, again, the flexibility to set yourself up to try different things, I think, is so key.
Well, and you and I have become, I don't know, acolytes, fans, whatever the word is, of this 10x is easier than 2x concept with Dan Sullivan and Ben Hardy. And Ben Hardy talks a lot about it in that book, that 10x isn't necessarily a literal 10x. He went from 0 kids, his wife couldn't get pregnant, they couldn't get pregnant, that issue, to they had 6 kids. Well, that's not 10 kids, but their life changed in a fundamental way. And when I think about your story of 10K on one property, 10K on another, and sort of snowballing that, I could see a situation really quickly where in a 10X model, my life is infinitely better. Infinite versus finite is, I'm taking cash flow from one of those properties and going to go make another one. And then I'm taking the other 10K that I've got and I'm just going to reduce stress.
Yeah.
I'm going to get somebody out of work. I'm going to work less. I'm going to go have more life balance.
I'm going to take an extra vacation, whatever it is.
Vacation. Yeah. I mean, but I think it's that point to the idea of, I want to have a better set of choices and I want to have more freedom in my life. And whatever that looks like for you, if that's just more dollars coming in, that's the answer.
Well, an income provides that flexibility because it either means you don't have to work as hard to generate your income because you got income coming from other sources, or you can level up your lifestyle because you have income from other sources.
Right.
I don't care which one you do, but you at least have the option. Or you can just reinvest all that money because you're trying to grow something. Again, not here to assert judgment on how you choose to use it, just that you can create it when you start thinking, how do I create a world of infinite possibilities, as opposed to how do I just park my money and maybe it's only doing one thing for me. If you can have your money providing more than one benefit, it is always worth exploring whether or not you actually want that. So that if I think about the overarching strategy, is some of the most important things that I think you have to understand is, how does it work, which is the math concept that we just played out. And then why would you use it? Or what would you use it for? And Eric, you said this kind of as we were prepping for this longer, more in-depth session.
Right.
We're not making these decisions in a vacuum.
Amen.
So it's not just, well, I can do this or this. It's, how do I set myself up so that when other opportunities show up or emergencies show up, I have the ability to deal with them in a way that is efficient. Either it doesn't completely derail my financial strategy,
Right.
or it actually enhances it.
Yeah. And all I know is that there's an opportunity or chaos somewhere in the future, and I don't know which it is. But whether it's opportunity or chaos, they all require capital. And so how do I
Right.
have it on board, right?
Right. And I want to say one more thing, because I've heard this language used a lot in certain circles that are talking about this concept. They talk about recapturing interest.
Oh, right. And this is a very
And
tools conversation, but that's good.
yeah, but I just want to make sure that we say this, because there is a misconception that you are borrowing your own money out of the insurance contract, and that is
Right.
not true for most whole life insurance policies. Yours is staying in the contract. They're just holding it as collateral, and they're loaning you their money, and they're charging you interest. So when you are paying that loan back, there is this misconception, because it's I'm going to use air quotes here, your bank. I don't actually mean it's your bank, right? That is
Right.
a term that gets thrown around in some of these communities, that you think you're paying your self interest. And the reality is that you are making payments to an institution. The benefit is
Right.
that you are retaining earning on your capital, not that you are recapturing interest that you are paying to somebody else.
Right. Right. And I think
That
it's
is
an
a
important distinction.
very important distinction.
Yep. Yep. I think it's critical. All right.
Because
So
I have people all the time that have been through a workshop and they're like, well, I thought I was paying myself back. No, you're not.
nope. Like you can make the semantic argument like and stretch it out, but fundamentally that's not true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm a technical stickler. So,
Yeah.
okay,
Let's
let's
be
move
right.
on.
All right. So let's talk. We talked about mindset ad nauseum. We talked about strategy ad nauseum. And let's talk about the last sort of structure on that in the tools section. Like, how do you
Yeah. And
know
I
it's the
don't,
right?
yeah, I don't think for today we're going to go into like all the technical specifics of how do you construct a whole life insurance
For
policy that
sure.
is optimized for the infinite banking concept. I think
Fair
that
enough.
would require many more hours than perhaps our listeners can endure.
Right.
But I do think the basics of how a whole life insurance policy works is important. So
Well, and
I'm
some
just
of the
going
features and words, like the buzzwords of how to go understand it, I think are really critical.
yeah. So I think one of the easiest ways to sort of set your expectations appropriately for how a whole life insurance policy is going to perform over time is almost to think of it as in the similar vein of a high yield savings account that happens to have a death benefit attached to it.
Yep.
Now, it's actually different than that because there's a differing cost structure. But essentially, you're looking at a conservative rate of return over time. And when you die, there is a death benefit that goes to the next generation or whoever you name as your beneficiary.
Right.
But I think there are, really a couple of things that get guaranteed in a whole life insurance policy that are very different than other types of insurance. And I will tell you that whole life insurance, that word, sometimes those words get applied to other types of policies that are not whole life insurance policies. And so I think there needs to be some education here. The question should be, is this contractually a whole life insurance policy, or is this a different flavor of permanent insurance? That is the question I would ask, because I have been on calls with people that I'm doing consulting for, where they are talking to an insurance agent who is pitching a universal life policy. And the agent says, yes, this is a whole life policy. And I have to jump in and say, no, it is not. This is a universal life policy. Can you explain the difference? And then they have to back up and explain the difference. But that happens actually a fair amount.
Yeah.
So what actually happens if it's contractually a whole life insurance policy is there's going to be a couple of guarantees: the premium, the cash value, and the death benefit. So Eric,
Right.
do you want to talk about those?
Yeah. So, and it's not a perfect analogy, but it's pretty close and it'll help. If I get a mortgage for a house, once I get the mortgage, and let's say it's $1,000 a month, because I can do this math, the mortgage company cannot come back in month 32 and go, we mispriced it. The interest rate environment's different. We're going to need more money. That's not something they can do. You have a contract that lasts for the X amount of time.
Fixed payment.
It's the same thing, right? In a whole life contract, once you set that up, you've made a deal with the insurance company and they can't come back and say, "Yeah, we guessed wrong. You're not 50 anymore. You're now 80. We're going to charge you more." Whatever the number it is at the start, they can't make that higher on the back end. So
So it's
that's one of
not like health insurance.
it's not like health insurance. It's not like term insurance. At the end of my term period, if I bought it when I was 20 and now I'm 40, well, my mortality, my likelihood I'm going to die tomorrow is very different at 40 than it was at 20. And as it happens, the price of that coverage goes up pretty dramatically. And
Mhm.
so in that vein, right, once you set that up, once you set up the premium, that they can't come back and change that.
Now, you can choose to put more in if you want to, if the
Correct.
contract is structured the way we would recommend, but
Right.
they cannot mandate that you pay more into the
Right.
contract at any point in time. That's why you do the underwriting at the front end. You want that payment to be levelized and set.
Right.
So that's the first thing that's guaranteed. The second one, so that's premium. Let's talk about death benefit actually next.
Yeah. And so the death benefit, same kind of thing. If it's $100,000, if it's $1 million at the beginning, as long as you're making those premium payments, they can't come back in and go, yeah, interest rate environment, blah, 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 is different. Now your $100,000 is worth 50, and they can't come back in and change that coverage. Now, just like anything else, it can go up, right? The coverage can go up with dividends and all the rest of the stuff that we'll get into in a second, but they can't make it go down as long as you're making those premium checks. Now, if you stop it, if you say, wow, I'm done with this thing, I don't want to make these premium payments anymore, and it's not past a point where it can sustain itself, then yeah, that can change the death benefit and some other things. But that's a you choice, not an insurance company choice.
Right. And that's also not true with other types of
Correct.
permanent contracts. So with a whole life insurance policy, that guarantee is really, really important. With other types of contracts, they can reduce the death benefit as you get older because of the way they charge their mortality experience to the contract. So,
Right. And they can change the premium for the same reason.
right, and the other type of contract. So we want a set premium and we want a death benefit that has a set floor so that we know it's never going to drop below this amount and it should grow over time. And then the third thing that's guaranteed is the cash value. So there are actually two ways that your cash value grows, but part of what you get with a whole life insurance contract is a guaranteed rate of return that gets applied to the cash value. So that over time, you look at what you're putting in. And if you look at what you're putting in plus the growth that is guaranteed upon it, at the day your policy reaches maturity, which is generally at this day and age, 121 years, the amount of money plus the guaranteed growth on the money that you have put into the contract becomes equal to their promised death benefit on like your 121st birthday.
Right.
So it's your money plus a guaranteed growth rate. Now, previously, that guaranteed growth rate was 4% across all whole life insurance policies.
Right.
Now, depending on the company that you're looking at, it could be anywhere between 2 and 4%.
Right. Right.
And those are gross returns before fees. So just to make sure you disclose that. And every insurance company is going to charge their fees a little bit differently. But there's actually a second way that your cash value can grow. So Eric, can you talk about dividends?
Yeah. So every year, right, there's an old joke that there's actuaries and Sicilian actuaries, and I'm sure that's non-PC somewhere, but like actuaries can tell you how many people are going to die, and the Sicilian actuaries can tell you which one is going to die, right?
Oh.
So what they're doing is actuarial tables, and they're saying, hey, we think 400 people are going to die this year across the board, right? Whatever the number is. And so we're going to go reserve for that. We're going to go set aside money to go do that. And when 398 people die, not 400, well, there's money left over. Or when the IT department spends less money than they should have, there's money left over. So basically a dividend is a return of profit back to the policy. And so when there is profit to be had, when the insurance company is managing their life well, their business well, there's a return of that profit in the form of a dividend back into the policy. Now, while the dividends are great, it's not a guarantee. So the guarantee is the guarantee. The dividend is, they can't guarantee they're going to be profitable every year. But the neat thing about dividends is once the dividend gets issued, they can't go back in later and go, we were just kidding. and take it back.
Right.
That becomes your
It
new
becomes
floor.
guaranteed.
Yeah.
Right. Perfect. So if you start looking at what's happening here, the goal is to fund an insurance contract in a way that if you're doing it specifically for infinite banking concept, which we generally in our office call the private reserve strategy, but if you are doing it for that purpose, then what you're looking at is kind of a blend of managing the cost structure of the policy
Right.
and making sure that you have the capacity to put as much money as you need to into the policy. And there's some rules that are set by the IRS. There's a concept called a modified endowment contract. And essentially what that means is that you put too much cash into your policy in a short time frame, given how big the death benefit is. So the IRS says if you overfund this too aggressively, it stops being insurance, and we're going to count it like an investment, which we don't want because insurance enjoys a very specific tax treatment, which is really, really beneficial for these particular concepts.
Yeah.
So we want to pay attention to that. But essentially what you want to do is build it so that you have high early cash value that then if you do want to borrow against, you have the opportunity to. And one of the carriers that we work with, if you tried to make a policy as absolutely skinny as you could, in year one, if you were to put $100,000 into that policy, you would have access to about $87,000 of what you put into it. So you have some insurance cost in there, but you have access to close to 87% of whatever you contributed to the policy in that first year. By year two, because of the cost structure, when you make a contribution to the policy, if you're maxing it out and kind of snuggling right up against how much can I actually get in here and keep the insurance tax treatment, you can get about 97% of that year's contribution that is immediately available to borrow against. And by year three, you can actually get to about 99 or 100%, depending on health ratings and age and all those types of things. And so when you look at what happens here, if you look at a traditionally funded whole life insurance policy, you might have $0 available in cash value in year three, versus if you are specifically building and constructing a policy because you know you want to use it for this purpose, you can absolutely start to minimize cost and maximize the access to the cash value. What you trade when you do that is that you have a much smaller death benefit than you would in the other scenario, which is why we think term is a good complement to make sure you get the amounts of death benefit you actually need.
Yeah, and I think that's such a key component of that is that really customizable design of exactly where you are and what's going on. Because I think a lot of the arguments against infinite banking or private reserve or whatever you want to call it is it's only for people that have tons and tons and tons of cash to go throw into this thing. Like it's only for the rich people that are just sitting on buckets of cash. And I'm like, no, most of the contracts that we have, most of the clients we work with, their monthly payments and they're $300, $400, $500 a month, whatever that number looks like that fits in their budget. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but we start where we start, and I got to save up money somewhere, and I want to have a vehicle to go do it. And to me, the funnest part of this job is that it's sort of part math, part art, and finding that sort of ability to have flexibility, the ability to meet what we're trying to go do and to blend it in. And there's very few contracts that are cookie cutter, that are not custom exactly down to the number of what that client's trying to go achieve, and being able to construct it just to meet their needs, and which makes it a lot of fun.
Well, and I think to that point, I mean, again, I think personal examples sometimes make things a little bit easier to learn.
Sure.
The very first policy that I started to fund, my monthly premium was $125. So not a crazy amount by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
And then my target funding for the whole life policy, what I was really trying to accomplish, and this was as aggressive as I could get, keeping the tax priorities, was $400 total. So I could put an extra $275 into the contract in any given month to try and maximize the access I had to cash. And I was fortunate enough that my parents actually had started a whole life insurance policy for me when I was about 7 years old. And we were able to roll that cash value into the policy that I started. And I did it for a couple of different reasons. Partly it was ease of servicing, and partly it was because I received the compensation of the cost in doing that. And so, and partly it was loan treatment. There were a lot of reasons to do it. But when I think about that particular move, by the time I was ready to buy my first house, and I was a weirdo who bought my first house in my early 20s, there was enough money that I borrowed for the down payment. And so I was able to put 10% down and then do a 90% loan for the property that I purchased. And so I was really essentially in a position where I could do 100% financing, because I used a combination of the insurance company's money and then the assets from a traditional mortgage.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes it fun. And that's where I think the other idea that infinite banking is a bank on yourself and you never need a bank again. I'm like, heck no. I'm going to need banks all the time. Like the mission is not a replacement. Because I remember I had a buddy of mine who was a banker, and he was walking through a seminar that we did. He goes, "Man, you really hate bankers." I'm like, "No, I not at all. There's only so much I can do, right? It's not a replacement. I just want to be in a better position."
Mm-hmm. Well, you want to have choices, because what happens is when you actually really need, I'm going to underline that word, when you need money and you go to a bank, they don't want to give it to you. It's too risky.
Right. Yeah.
If you have all the money and you're like, "Hey, can you make me a loan?" They're like, "Heck yeah, I'll loan to you all day long," because they know you're not going to default. You've got the capital sitting right there. You're a risk they're willing to take. And so this is just putting you into a position of financial strength.
Yeah. All right. So let's go ahead into the guaranteed versus some of that.
Well, I was going to talk for a second about some of the things that came up in this other podcast, because I think there's some things here. One of the things that they actually, I think, came to the right conclusions about non-direct recognition versus direct recognition.
I was going to say that.
Stuff. Do you want to explain the difference between the two?
Yeah, so it's really easy. Direct recognition, and I'm going to give you the technical and then the practical. They're directly recognizing the loan against your cash value. And the easiest way to think about a direct recognition concept is think about it like a 401k. Most 401ks out there have a loan feature. So you can borrow typically half of the money in your 401k up to 50K. When you take a loan from your 401k, and let's say you had, I don't know, 30 grand in your 401k, if you borrowed 10, some dweeb on the other end is jumping in the computer, selling off $10,000 worth of whatever stock you got, and then they write you a check. Your $30,000 is now $20,000, and you're off to the races. And when you pay it back, you're trying to catch up. That's direct recognition. And a non-direct, and a lot of concepts. I want
to add one other thing, because there is one other way that direct recognition happens as well, which is where they leave your money invested for you, but they penalize your dividend. So you may still be borrowing the insurance company's money in that situation, and they may just be penalizing the dividend. So there are different ways that structure can show up.
Right. And there are a number of versions of whole life that are direct recognition, and your mileage may vary. It's in the fine print of understanding how they treat loans. The other way is what we will call non-direct recognition, which means they're not directly recognizing the loan against your growth. And in that stupid story from before, you've got 30 grand, you borrow 10, the contract, the insurance policy continues to grow as if there's the 30K there. They're not penalizing your growth rate. And so that's right. And in every case we can, that is a more efficient way to go do it.
Right. Okay. And I don't think we need to spend a whole lot more time on that particular one, but I think, can we talk about fees for just a second?
Yep. So I think they did actually a fair job of this in that podcast.
Yeah, I think they did too. And so, they talked about a high fee structure. And I think the thing that we have to remember is that cost is only a factor in the absence of value. Right. That is direct Ericism right there. And it is, the first time he said it, I was like, dang, my mind is blown. But I think about it a lot, because if you tell me I have to give you $5 and you're going to give me 10, I'll do that all day long, even though the cost is $5. You're keeping $5, right?
Right.
You may be taking that and investing it and doing some other things with it, but my cost is $5, and then you're returning me 10. Now, if you tell me, oh, but Mary, if you just give me $1, I'm going to give you $1.50 back. Well, I may be minimizing my cost at that point, but I'm also minimizing my upside. And so if I think about what happens with fees, sometimes you get lower fees because you're getting higher rates of return. But anytime you are adding in guarantees, your fees are going to be higher.
Right.
Because somebody has to make sure that everything is working exactly the way it is to make sure that everything is performing. And remember, this is not where we're trying to get our highest rates of return. This is where we want steady and predictable, because if it's steady and predictable, we can borrow against it without risk of having a note called due because our investments are upside down. And I think actually this is one more thing that I want to clarify here. A whole life insurance policy is not an investment. It is a savings tool, because an investment always has risk of loss and a savings tool only has growth. And when you eliminate risk of loss, sometimes your upside just isn't quite as high. So I felt okay. You're right with the fee structure, but where I guess I started to get uncomfortable is that they cited a study, which I read. And I mean, some of these studies are like 10 years old and then they just keep using them. But they said the average rate of return in a whole life insurance policy was 2 and some change percent. And I was like, which policies are you looking at? Because I wouldn't sell that one. I mean, when you think about what an average is, it is merging the top performers with the worst performers in the industry.
Right.
If you are just looking at the top 10% of performers, you are going to have different rates of return than if you were including the companies that are, startup, high cost, haven't figured out how to do this yet, or having issues.
Right.
So I think finding a reputable company is very important. But then when they, and I see this a lot in the investment versus insurance comparison, then when they talk about what you can get in the market, they talk about some of the upper echelons of performance.
And it's like, judge me on both ends of it. I'm fine, but judge yourself too.
Let's just be consistent. Just be consistent in your analysis. So if you want to say like, okay, well, the S&P 500 is averaged about 10%. Okay, well, that's the S&P 500, right? And a lot of people just buy an index funds. That's a fair investment to look at, because even though it has maybe 500 different companies in it, there are a lot of people who just put their money in an index fund and that is their real experience. But that's not actually their real experience.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. So talk about that.
Yeah. So there was a little underfunded organization.
Get on your soapbox. Go. Let's do it.
Preach it. So there was a company called Dalbar that has done this study for, I don't know, 1 billion years now, right? Of what the average rate of return was in whatever market, index, S&P 500 bonds, whatever the deal is. And then what the average investor experiences and what they really get on the other end of it. And what they find is that it's typically 4 to 5 percentage points less pretty consistently versus what the market's going to give you. So if the market was going to give you, let's say 10%, right? The most of the time, the average investor has the experience of somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 to 6% on the high side. And the reason is because we have FOMO and FOLO. And when the market's going up and about halfway through, we're like, man, baby, my cabbie is giving me investment advice. He's winning. I'm a sucker. I've got to get in. And we jump in. But we don't jump in at the bottom because nobody does that, right? We jump in about half the way up. The market tips over. It gets dicey. We start seeing some chop. And we have FOLO, fear of losing out. And we pull the money out and we're like, because I don't want to ride this baby back down. We don't ride it all the way back down, but we've ridden it down a little bit. And then we're like, when it hits the bottom, I'm going to get back in. Nobody buys at the bottom. We buy when it's about halfway up on the other end. And we're like, man, I don't want to miss out. So we don't really ever get the full market experience because most people emotionally can't tolerate it.
Right.
And most of the people on the other end of that aren't only buying the S&P 500 index because that's a fairly aggressive portfolio.
Right.
They're buying some S&P, some bonds, some real estate, some REITs, whatever. They're
You're
mixing
diversifying because they heard that that's what you're supposed to do.
Because that's what smart people do. And so because they're doing that, they're not getting 10%. They're getting some muted version of that because they're spreading their risk.
That's further muted by their own behavior.
and it's further muted by their own behavior. And then they go, what? The market gives me X. I should be getting X. It's like, well, yeah, but there's these stupid things called humans in the mix that keep screwing up your math.
Well, and sometimes it's the advisor who's making recommendations because they're trying to keep you from firing them that does that, even if it's not your own behavior, right? I mean,
Amen.
And I think this is so important here because so much of what we are talking about, again, goes to human behavior. It's not just what the math shows you. It's what people actually do. And so people don't usually look at their whole life policy and be like, man, I got to get out of this because I'm losing money, because you can't lose money.
Right.
Like, there is no time where the market drops and your whole life cash value goes down. That doesn't happen. Once the cash value shows up in your account, it can only ever grow.
Right.
And so this is about, okay, if you're going to say the average return is 2.5, that's different than picking a company that is at the top of performance, right? And so if we're going to talk about like, oh, the S&P might be the top of performance and the equivalent in an account over here, but if you're going to compare what an insurance policy is doing to include that bottom quartile of all performance, then you better put every mutual fund investor that is just, hosing it into that same calculation that you're doing, and then put in human behavior on top of it. And my guess, just based on the studies that I've read and it's kind of taking this information together, it's actually not that different. But again, nobody actually wants to hear that. So, I think there's something to consider there as well.
And to their point and to their credit, you're never going to get, well, you could maybe in some dystopian world, you're not going to get 30% rate of return in a whole life contract. That's not a thing. Like, so, but that's not
historically, so that's probably an okay statement.
Right. Yeah. But that's also not its job. I don't, the stupid golf analogy, right? I don't yell at my putter because I didn't get 300 yards out of it. Like, that's because it's not its job. Like, I don't yell at my fish for being a bad dog or whatever the stupid thing I said earlier. Like, that's not its job in the system, right? Its job in the system is to do a very different role and to coordinate with the other stuff that's doing a very different role. And it goes back to kind of the argument that I've got for a lot of this is the all-in-one printer is okay, but it's an okay fax machine. It's a so-so printer. It's a so-so scanner. Like, it doesn't do any one thing really well, but we have it in there because it seems nice and it fits on a desk. But life is slightly more complicated than that, and we need different tools doing different jobs at different times.
Right.
Sorry.
So, Eric, do we want to do like an actual example and crunch some numbers? And then, I think probably we got some butts that are at the end of their endurance level.
Yeah. Including ours at that point.
Yeah. So I'm going to, I'll pull something up and we can kind of walk through it here. Let me share my screen. And here we go. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
All right. If you're not watching, I'm going to walk through this as best as I can. So this is from an example, and I've pulled most of the salient details from it that I got to do a little bit of consulting for. And it was from a young-ish woman. She was probably about 40 years old. And she was looking at, what do I do for the next 25 years so that I can actually get to a place where I could retire?
Right.
And the situation that she was in whenever we first met her was that she had about $120,000 sitting in an IRA. So a traditional IRA. It had been a 401k. She rolled it over into a traditional IRA, had about $120,000 in it. And she had $20,000 sitting in a checking account that was not earning any interest. When I asked her how much money she was saving on a monthly basis, she said just over $200. The amount that it actually worked out to throughout the course of the year was about $2,620. So I'm using this example because it's a very approachable example. And if you're like, man, I can save 10 times that, great, add a zero to all the numbers that I'm talking about right now.
Right.
Cool. The math is going to stay the same. It's pretty linear in terms of application.
Right.
What she was doing is she was taking $15,000 out of that cash account, and she was using that for a private money loan to a group of investors that she was working with. And what she would do is she would make loans with a 6-month term and a 12-month interest rate. And then she would charge 3 points up front. So if you just look at a 12% interest rate amortized over the course of the year, and then add the 3 points twice, that's 18%, right? So we've got 6 total points charged up front plus 12% in interest. And I think that, at least when we were having a conversation, was pretty typical, certainly in the group, the Real Estate Investors Club that she was a part of.
Yeah.
And so if you just do the amortization at 18%, the amount of interest that she receives over the course of the year is about $1,502. And I think the first thing that is worth noting is that even though the interest rate is 18%, the actual return is more like 10 because of the way amortizing interest works. And so this goes back to that very, very important idea at the very, very beginning of these concepts when we played that card game, that when you look at this, it's on a shrinking balance. And so it's not as linear as we want it to be. So they were doing this from some type of structure or entity. And this is based off of information that she gave me that I have not confirmed, but she was paying taxes at about 20%. So her net return was $1,201.
Right.
So if you push the wrong button. So if you look at what happens in her system, she was taking that $1,201 and sticking it right back into that checking account where it wasn't earning anything. So there's no return on those dollars as they're coming in. So what she asked me to do was she said, keep the math really simple so that it's easy for me to follow as we go through and do this. Just assume I keep making $15,000 loans for the rest of my time. I said, great. So if you run the math out over a 25-year time period, her cash position between the $20,000 she started with, the $2,620 she was saving each year, and the $1,201 of net income getting deposited back into her checking account, because that's where she started when I first started talking to her, is that when she hit 65, her cash assets are $115,525. 115, right? Her 401k with no contributions to it, because it was just sitting in an IRA now, just continuing to grow. If it earns 6%, which is the number she asked me to use, there'd be $515,000 in that account. So if you follow the safe withdrawal rates that are accepted by most of the industry today at a 3% distribution rate from all of her assets at retirement, her income would be just under $19,000 a year. She was very clear that she could not live off of that. Right. So the first thing that we did is we designed an insurance contract using her actual assets. So we said, what would happen if we put $20,000 into the cash portion of the policy? And then we set it up so that her ongoing mandatory contribution that she was comfortable with was the $2,620 she mentioned before. So the $2,620. So in the first year, she was able to put in just over $22,000 into the contract, and the cash value that she had access to within 30 days of that initial funding was pretty close to $19,000. So enough there that she could take $15,000 and make the loan if she wanted to. If she doesn't take a loan, though, she just keeps doing this funding and she never does the private money lending. By the time she gets to age 65, she has $125,000 sitting in the cash value of the policy, as opposed to $115,000 using a checking account and taking the risk of doing private money lending. But in addition to the $125,000 in the cash value, she also had $303,000 in the death benefit. So then she said, okay, what happens if I take the loan? Well, the first thing that we have to do is we have to measure cost of capital. So we need to know when we take $15,000, what we're doing, remember, is that we are borrowing from the insurance company. The loan rate for the company that she was going to work with at the time was 4.76%.
Right.
So if you look at what happens over a year, the total amount of interest that she would pay to the insurance company using the infinite banking concept, where she's borrowing against the insurance contract, she actually has to pay $390 to the insurance company for the privilege of using their money.
Yeah. Interest is
So
a cost, full on.
it is. Yeah.
Yep.
So if you subtract that 390 from the 1502 that she was going to make doing the private loan, she ends up with $1,112. Well, if we assume her tax rate is the same at 20% in this scenario, her net return after she pays taxes is $889. So you think about that, she had a higher return before, didn't she?
Right.
I mean, that's what it looks like on paper, because she's got the 1201 in the first scenario that she's putting back into her checking account, but she's got 889 she's working with here.
Right.
Well, if you add that in each year,
right,
you end up with $159,000 in the cash value of the policy at age 65, and the death benefit grows to $369,000.
So it was 303 before on the death benefit, and now it's 369. Remind me, what was the cash?
The cash was $125,000 in the policy initially. And then after she uses the money, pays the loan back, and then puts in the returns from 889, once she puts that into the policy, she ends up at 160.
Okay.
So if you think about the difference between the two, if she did that private money lending and she was doing it with cash, at 65, she has $115,000.
Right.
Doing it using the insurance policy, the cash equivalent, the cash value is $159,000.
Right.
So if you look at the difference between those two, that is a cash on cash increase. She didn't do any more work. She was doing exactly the same thing. She just did it differently. The cash on cash increase is more than $43,000.
Right.
That's
37. She didn't take any more risk. I think that's the key part of that.
Right. She just did it more efficiently.
Correct.
So she ends up right there better off. And then if you look at the death benefit, let's assume that she borrowed out and spent the entire $159,000 of cash value and then passed away the very next day. In the event that that happened, there would still be $210,000 of the death benefit left over, because the death benefit was $369. When you subtract out the $159 that she spent in that scenario, when she graduates from the planet, there's still $210,000 that goes to the next generation.
Right.
If you look at the material improvement on the cash, it's about 300%. Those numbers are insane. That's why when people start exaggerating this concept, I'm like, what are you doing?
Yeah, we don't need to oversell anything.
Here it is. This is the cash on cash situation.
Right.
And I think this is the funny part, right? But wait, there's more. At the risk of sounding like that used car salesperson, if you are combining this particular strategy with what we teach for income creation, there's an added benefit, because instead of being stuck at a 3% distribution in the first scenario, where you can only spend about $19,000 of income per year, having a combination of investments and insurance assets changes how you can spend your money.
Yep.
And when I think about the material impact here, if you have money that's sitting in the market or in a real estate property or wherever it is, so in this case, we said it was sitting in that 401k. If the market takes a loss and you've got all that money you've accumulated in the insurance contract, then you can just stop withdrawing from your market-based portfolio and spend the money in the cash value, and then pivot back once your portfolio has recovered.
Right. So what was the outcome on the other end of it for income then? Because she was living, she was going to live on 18 grand.
Right. So we teach two things. One is the market shock absorber, which is what I just talked about. The other is creating a simulated pension. And these are sort of, usually we lay these as the foundation, and then we layer the infinite banking concept or the private reserve strategy. Same thing. We just call it the private reserve strategy. We layer that on top of it.
Right.
But this way we're doing it backwards, where we're showing here's where you get, and then here's where you spend it.
Right.
So if you pursued the conventional method, you're at about 19,000. If you do the simulated pension at retirement, you end up with about 39,000 of income. And if you do the market shock absorber, you're at about 33,000. So if I take the average between the simulated pension and the shock absorber, it's about $36,000.
Right.
The difference between the two strategies is an additional $17,635 of income per year.
Yeah.
Not because we're taking more risk, but because we're adding in more efficient distributions that you only get if you have the whole life insurance policy incorporated into the overall structure. Now you
Right.
can't, if all you have is insurance, you can't do these two strategies. You
That's
have
what I
to
was
have
going to show you. Yeah.
You
Well,
have to have.
Yeah, and I think the key there is, because we had mentioned this, and I know we're coming up to time. Securities-backed lines of credit, HELOCs, all sorts of other ways to go do similar strategies to private reserve, or what some people call IBC. But to me, where the insurance piece comes in to make it stronger is not just a funding vehicle to go buy things. It is a way to go have a multiplier on the back end so that I get more income. And to me, it's that point that it doesn't do anything, but it makes everything you're doing better. It's a multiplier effect for whatever you're doing in a traditional plan.
Right. And so if you take that increase in the income, that one year, right, instead of having $18,915 of income, now you've got $36,550.
Right.
You've got $17,635 more income.
More.
Well, if this person lives to be 95 years old, that's 30 years of income. That's $529,000 that they get to spend and enjoy during their lifetime that they would not have otherwise enjoyed.
Right.
And then if
a
you
legacy.
look at, right, and you look at what happens then with the minimum inheritance for that next generation, starting at that 369 number, the material improvement was almost $900,000, the 529 plus the 369 of death benefit.
Right.
And we aren't talking giant numbers. We're talking about somebody that had $120,000 in an IRA and could save a little over $200 a month.
Yeah, this is, and even, I think you made the point earlier, right? Well, if they couldn't live on $18,000 a year, they may not be living on much at 36 if that's all they had, but just add a zero. Just add a zero.
I mean,
and it's material.
You add a zero to those numbers, right? You're talking about going from what, 180,000 to 360.
Right.
Because the ratios stay the same.
Right.
If you add the zero.
Right. Right. And I think it's that piece, right? That efficiency piece, that idea of having, I want to win in all scenarios, but I don't want to have to do it through brute force.
I don't want to have to take a bunch of risk to get there.
Yeah.
I want to know that I'm already strategically and efficiently better off, so that if I take risk, it can be very calculated, and I know the impact if my investment works, and I know the impact if it doesn't. And I just want to wrap this up and put a nice little bow on it. Anytime you are just looking at one product versus another product, and you are looking at what gets the best rate of return, you will end up, if that is your metric, potentially with a higher net worth when you get to retirement,
Yes.
but it doesn't mean you're going to have more income. When you build a system where your dollars can generate multiple benefits for you versus only one benefit, you have more potential both for net worth and for income than you would in a system where each dollar is only doing one thing.
Right.
So that's the first shift. And then changing to efficient distributions on the back end is the second shift. When you add those two things together, the material improvement is more than most of us would even realize is possible. And we aren't doing it in a way that's creating more risk. We are just being more efficient. And I think that's the thing that we have to go back to, is that if we do these really oversimplified linear comparisons, 6 is bigger than 4. Sure, sometimes.
Right.
Not if one's amortizing and the other is compounding.
Right. or 120 or 1.2 million in their example, right? You'd have all this more money. Maybe if I'm just looking at net worth, sure, it's a no-brainer, but not the whole system.
Right.
Yeah.
So hopefully that at least gave you guys new questions to ask, because that was a lot of information. It was very dense. I can tell Eric is getting tired of talking. He's ready to go. He's like, it's dinner time and we're recording this, Mary. Wrap it up, wrap it up. So thank you guys for joining with us and sticking with us through definitely some very dense information.
Yeah.
But I hope it addressed some of the questions that maybe have come up as you've been exposed to this concept before, and where it's appropriate to use it, where it isn't, how it integrates with the bigger financial picture. If you have questions and you want to talk to either one of us about your specific situation or even a hypothetical, Eric, where can they reach you?
Wherever you economics with Eric, wherever you social media.
It's not Ericonomics. Try again.
Do it Ericonomics. Economics with Eric. How about you, Mary?
If you're looking for me, you can find me at The Wealth Woman wherever you social media. Thank you so much for spending all of this time with us. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Specific financial concepts and advanced strategies are presented to you for educational purposes only. We cannot and do not guarantee their applicability to your individual circumstance. We encourage you to seek personalized advice from qualified professionals on all financial matters.
Provided content is for overview and is not intended and should not be relied upon as individualized tax, legal, fiduciary, or investment advice. Neither Wealth Woman, Acorn Grove, or the Wealth and Income Podcast, nor their representatives provide tax or legal advice. For answers to specific questions and before making any decision, please consult a qualified attorney or tax advisors.
All numeric examples and any individual shown are hypothetical and were used for explanatory purposes only. Actual results may vary.
Investing involves risk, which includes potential loss of principal. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Guarantees are subject to the claims paying ability of the issuing insurance company.
Life insurance should be purchased by individuals that have a need to provide a death benefit to protect others with insurable interest in their lives against financial loss. Life insurance is not a retirement plan, investment, or savings account.
Not affiliated with or endorsed by the Social Security Administration, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or any governmental agency. Insurance and investment products, not a deposit, not FDIC or NCUA insured, not insured by any federal government agency, not guaranteed by any bank or credit union, may lose value.
Please visit the Wealth Woman website disclosure page for other important disclosures.